Good morning, everyone. It's such an honor to be here, and I want to say a few things by way of introduction. The first is to express my profound gratitude for the opportunity to speak. I feel really terrified, actually, at this opportunity, and so my gratitude is tinged with a hint of terror. And I feel terrified for two reasons. The first is, during the process of studying and researching the life of Blessed Charles de Foucauld, I fell in love with him, and I want to do him justice. So I'm afraid that I won't do him justice. So if you leave with anything but love for Charles de Foucauld, you should attribute that to my poor presentation and go off and read and discover his life for yourself. The second reason why I'm feeling a bit terrified at the prospect of giving this lecture is because I'm so grateful at the invitation from the Institute for Church Life, and so grateful for the presence of the Institute for Church Life on the campus of the University of Notre Dame. The Institute for Church Life is a light, not in the darkness, because there are other lights around, but it is an illumination for our campus through the many different programs. And I just encourage you to discover all of the things from Notre Dame Vision to the work that the Institute does with catechesis through the ECHO program and many other programs done by the Institute for Church Life. So I'm grateful and in awe of the work of Professor John Cavadini, and grateful to everyone else, the whole team there, especially to Valerie McCants, who worked on organizing this lecture. So that's like the first introduction. And then the second introduction is, I'd like to say a little bit about the irony of giving a talk devoted to the life of Blessed Charles de Foucauld. Because as we'll discover, I hope, during this talk, the heart of his devotion, the heart of his spirituality, was the person of Christ. We'll see in a special way he was dedicated to the hidden years of Christ. Whereas, many people focus on the ministry of Christ, the active ministry, and especially his passion and resurrection. He was in a special way devoted to the hidden years or the hidden life of Christ at Nazareth, when he was a simple, poor worker. He was also dedicated to Christ in a special way through the Eucharist, and that's something which is many of you might have experienced in recent years. Is a renewed attention to Eucharistic adoration. Blessed Charles, as we'll discover, in the rule that he wrote for his order, which actually never came into being during his lifetime, only after his lifetime, known as the Little Brothers and Little Sisters of Jesus, there were 5 hours of Eucharistic adoration each day in the rule that he wrote. So he had this special dedication to Jesus, and that dedication to Christ also was expressed in a way in which he said, we need to orient ourselves not away from the saints, but in a special way towards Christ. Everything should be directed towards Christ. And so this talk is a bit ironic that the attention is on a saint. He's blessed, but let's call him a saint for today. And we might just keep in mind that thinking of Charles de Foucauld should be a way that leads us to think more deeply and profoundly on the life of Christ. I think that's what he would have wanted. Okay, that's the second introduction. There's only one introduction left, and then I'll actually start my talk. And I'd just like to, reflect on my personal connection to the life of Charles de Foucauld, which, of course, Charles de Foucauld, as we'll discover, he dies in 1916, and so I never met him. But in the year 1998, in the summer, I had spent the summer in Syria. Of course, this was long before the Syrian Civil War. And I visited a monastery known as Der Marmusa, which means the Monastery of Saint Moses. And it was founded by an Italian who was a scholar of Islam. His name is Paolo Dell'Olio. Paolo Dell'Olio, later, when the Civil War broke out, was kidnapped and, as far as we know, has been executed. So he lived his life in dedication to Muslim-Christian relations, having founded a monastery in Syria, and eventually gave his life to that cause. He was kidnapped, or he was abducted during the process of negotiating for the release of other Christian hostages of ISIS in the city of Raqqa in Syria. But Paolo Dell'Olio founded his monastery on the vision of someone named Louis Massignon, who's going to come into our talk. Louis Massignon was another scholar of Islam, French, not Italian, who had an experience of conversion during his study of Islam. and eventually was ordained, as we'll see by the end of this talk, as a priest in 1950. But Massignon's whole spirituality was shaped by Charles de Foucauld. And in a special way, he was attracted by the life of Charles de Foucauld as a hermit in the desert, in the heart of the Islamic world in North Africa, and many times considered joining Charles de Foucauld in the desert. As we'll see, the two of them, de Foucauld and Massignon, knew each other very well. Well, that's a little bit connected with my own life story. As Professor Cavadini mentioned, I'm a scholar of Islam. I was trained just in religious studies in graduate school, studied Islam also in the Middle East under Muslim teachers, but I'm also a Catholic. And so one of the great challenges I have in my personal vocation is thinking about my disposition vis-a-vis Islam and how especially my own identity as a Christian and my love for my faith and my church corresponds with my calling towards understanding Islam authentically as Muslims understand it, and also engaging in dialogue with Muslims. We'll see that for de Foucauld, that was something that moved him deeply, that dialectic between truth, proclamation, and dialogue, that balance, finding that balance. And he had an experience in the year 1908 where he came still, although he was still evangelical, he came to a deep appreciation of the spirituality of the Muslims around him in that year when he was living in the southern desert of Algeria. And he came to be convinced that Muslims, even though they're not baptized, can receive the mercy of God and salvation. And a lot of those thoughts have affected me as I've gone through my journey here, now 15 years teaching at the University of Notre Dame. And in some ways, my vocation, I think, was marked by that visit to the desert monastery in Syria known as Deir Marmousa. Okay, so if you survived my 3 introductory points, we can actually start the talk. We're going to take a journey through the life of Blessed Charles de Foucauld, and we're going to look at different stages of his life. I know there have been a number of ways of presenting Saturday with the Saints talk, and some have been more thematic or really deep explorations of the spirituality of certain saints. We're going to be mostly biographical. So we're going to look at these different stages of Charles de Foucault's life, his youth, his time as an explorer before his conversion back or reversion to his Catholic faith, and then his vocation to the Trappists initially, which will take him to Syria. His life actually in Nazareth. He was so intrigued by the vision of the hidden years of Christ in Nazareth that he went and he lived there for several years. And then the end of his life, which he spent in North Africa, in Algeria, first in the western settlement of Beni Abbas, and then in the southern encampment of Tamen Rasset. We'll begin then our exploration of the life of Charles de Foucauld. We see some images of him here by looking at his young life. And his young life is interesting and compelling to many because of the way he radically abandoned the faith and then through a radical process of conversion returned to it. So if you know those, maybe family, friends who have left the faith, who are exploring outside of the bounds of the church, looking for truth, the example of Charles de Foucauld can give us hope that God can call them even in the different places they might be. Charles de Foucauld was born in 1858 in a noble family in Strasbourg. You may know that Strasbourg has passed, this region of Alsace in France has passed back between France and Germany in 1858. It was part of France. In 1870, it would be occupied by Germany, or more specifically by the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War. He was born a wealthy noble, a vicomte or viscount, and at the age of 20, when his grandfather passed away, he became a very wealthy man, so wealthy that he was known for hosting the greatest parties at his military academy. Not only did he host great parties and eat foie gras and drink expensive champagne and smoke Cuban cigars, but he also spent a lot of money on prostitutes. So we'll learn more about that. He had the reputation of liking all of the physical pleasures, including eating. People were concerned when he was around the table because he would eat all the food. He even gained the nickname the pig, le porc, in French, because he had such a voracious appetite, and all of that anticipates his later asceticism. We're going to see he came to a point by the time he settled in Nazareth where he only ate bread and water and only once a day. And the Port Clare sisters whom he was serving would actually insist that he come in once in a while to join them for a meal, or they would deliver figs and dates and almonds to him. In 1871, his family had settled, his grandfather, who was taking care of him, had settled in Nancy because both of his parents died when he was young. In Nancy in France, after the Franco-Prussian War, he went to a secular or laïque school, and he remembers how this was the beginning of his departure from the ways of faith. And he has this interesting quotation, where he says, listen, these schools claim to be impartial, but the nature of the impartiality actually is leading people away from truth. It's impartial to the sense that it's even indifferent to the truth. And so it does harm in a way. I think that was interesting when reflecting on the vocation of a Catholic university today. Some people would criticize a Catholic university saying that, is there true academic or intellectual freedom? But can there be freedom apart from the truth? We could speak about that maybe during the discussion. After that, he did go to a Catholic university, to the Jesuit Saint Geneviève in Paris. But by this time, he had lost his faith. And so you can see some of the comments written by one of his biographers, Jean-Jacques Antier, who speaks about the agnostic, even atheistic attitude of Charles de Foucauld at this time. And from Saint-Geneviève, he continued in a military school called Saint-Cyr in Paris, and eventually was assigned. He did pretty well in Saint-Cyr. He placed towards the top of his class. But by the time that allowed him to choose Calvary, which was a prestigious division in the French army at the time, and he was sent off to a place called Saumur, which was specifically for the training of cavalry officers. Saumur is towards the south of France, and as I alluded to before, he became known for his love of champagne and cigars and prostitutes. In fact, the story goes that he was so addicted to this life of wealth that he would have cigars brought in specially for him, Cuban cigars, and eventually when he became tired of the prostitutes in Saumur, apparently they're not the greatest prostitutes, not sure how you rate these things, he had them brought in from Paris especially for him. And he got the prestigious mark of 87, meaning dead last in his class of officer cadets. So he graduated. So, if there are any students here and you get like a B+ and you're worried about it and you're feeling depressed, think of Charles de Foucauld. He fell in love with a woman known as Marie Cardinal, or Mimi, who was an actress in Paris. And when he was assigned after graduating from Saumur to service in Algeria, he brought her with her and bought a ticket for her on a ship and called her Madame de Foucauld so that she could travel with him, but was eventually sentenced by the military for living outside of wedlock and removed from active duty. Imagine if those sort of penalties were applied today, what would happen to most of our society. He was eventually reinstated, and even though he continued to be living his licentious lifestyle, he served honorably in southern Algeria and was remembered for his bravery in combat. But it wasn't his vocation. In 1882, he resigned from active duty, although maintained a reserve status as a military officer, and he departed to explore Morocco. And this is maybe the beginning of one theme that we see in the life of Charles de Foucauld, which is restlessness. And it's something that, according to, as we'll see, his confessor and spiritual guide, who is a man by the name of Father Ouvelin, was something that kept Charles de Foucauld from maintaining stability in the spiritual life. So this is something already before his conversion that marked his lifestyle. He wasn't satisfied staying with the military, and he had this vision of traveling into the then unknown territory of southern Morocco. The problem with traveling to Morocco at the time, by the way, Algeria was colonized by the French in the early 19th century, so it's already been decades under French control, but not so Morocco. Eventually it would become a French protectorate, but at this time Morocco continued to be independent, ruled by a Muslim emirate. There it had recently broken away from the Ottoman Empire, and there were no Christians in Morocco. But there was a long-standing community of Jews in Morocco whose presence dates back to the Middle Ages. And so with the advice of an Irish librarian in Algiers connected to the French Geographical Society, he decided that he could enter into this unknown country by disguising himself and taking on the personality of a Jew. He was white-skinned, and so he called himself a Russian Jew who had gone to discover the Jewish communities of northwestern Africa. This is a picture not of Charles de Foucauld, but this is the Rabbi Mordecai, who was a Moroccan Jew, who acted as his guide during the journey. I've already mentioned that. During his journey, he received scorn everywhere he went, and he discovered what it was to be, what it meant to be a Jew. There's one story about French officers, while he was still in Algeria, but he had taken on the clothing and disguised himself as the Russian Jewish hermit, or pilgrim rather. And French officers saw him and didn't recognize him, and they said, "Look at this miserable Jew. Doesn't he indeed look more like a monkey than a man?" And later on, also, the scorn didn't only come from the French officers, but during his travels in Morocco, he constantly received scorn from Muslims who looked down as Jews, on occasion were called unbelievers. But not all of it was religious. Some of it was just racial and intolerance of Jews that had been part of Moroccan society. So I just wonder, was this a first step in what we see so prominent in his later spirituality, which is this desire for scorn, this desire to be the least and the last? He hid his notebook in a sleeve, scientific instruments in a goatskin bag. He grew the ritual side locks of tefillin of Jews and wandered barefoot into southern Morocco. He would take measurements, geographical measurements with his instruments secretly from the rooftop when he could. And the publication of his travel was a great success. It won a gold medal from the French Geographical Society, and he was honored also by the University of Paris or the Sorbonne. It was soon after this, when he returned to France, that he had the experience of conversion. And there are two figures that entered into the life of Blessed Charles de Foucauld, which affected or inspired his conversion. The first was a cousin whose name was Marie de Bondy. Just one second before we get into this. Marie de Bondy, who had been, unbeknownst to Charles de Foucauld, had been praying, a little bit like Monica and St. Augustine, praying for his conversion for years. She was a faithful Catholic who had, being part of this noble family, lived a very different lifestyle than that of Charles de Foucauld, the poor Russian pilgrim. And the other was a man named Father Ouvelin, who would eventually become his confessor. But during this time, Charles de Foucauld had also discovered Islam in Morocco. So here I ask this question: was he interested in Islam, having lived in Algeria, served in Algeria, traveled through Morocco, written this geographical account of the country? And the answer is yes. Okay. In fact, he wrote, "Islam appealed to me too strongly. I was very attracted to its simplicity of dogma, hierarchy, morality." One observer commented that Islam, sorry for the typo there, was his religious seduction. This is something common, I think, to the experience of many Catholics who enter deeply or profoundly into the study of Islam. There's a point where you recognize the beauty that Muslims see, and also you learn to admire the passion or fidelity of Muslims to the dictates of their faith. Sometimes there's a sense of dissatisfaction observing Muslims praying 5 times a day, or doing a fast which involves a 30-day fast, not eating or drinking during daylight hours, and comparing it to our fast, which in the Reynolds household is like giving up M&Ms. That's like the Lenten fast is giving up M&Ms. So it's not exactly the same thing. And so he did feel strongly attracted to Islam, but there's something he felt missing. And these are difficult questions to think about. But he did feel that the mystery or the spirituality of Christianity, in which the divine becomes present within each human's life in a mystical way, was missing. He wrote, I'll just skip past Louis Massignon for a second. He wrote, I could see clearly that Islam was without a divine basis, in that the truth was not there. We'll speak a little bit more about this, because this is a complicated question. He had a heart for Muslims, he loved Muslims, but he also still had a zeal for evangelization. His conversion took place at a church in Paris named Saint Augustine or Saint Augustin. As I mentioned, the two inspirations in his life were his cousin, Marie de Bondy, and Father Ouvelin, Henri Ouvelin. And the conversion took place in 1886 in the month of October, so it almost corresponds with our date here. And he recounts having prayed one time on his knees in the Church of St. Augustine, "Oh God, if you exist, let me know you." And he heard this response: "You would not be seeking me if you had not already found me." Soon after that, October 30th, around the feast of All Saints' Day, he went into the confessional. He had heard Father Ouvelin preach often and was attracted to his passion for the faith. And he went into the confessional and he said, "Listen, I'm not here to confess. In fact, I'm unable to believe you. There are all the obstacles of the mysteries, the dogma, and the miracles." Do you know what Father Ouvelin said? "Yes, you are here to confess." He responded, "You are mistaken. What is missing now, in order for you to believe, is a pure heart. Go down on your knees, make your confession to God, and you will believe." Yeah, that boldness of Father Ouvelin changed the life of Charles de Foucauld, because he did confess, and then Father Ouvelin said, "Have you eaten anything today?" And today we might think, what kind of question is that? But of course, at that time, you wouldn't receive communion having eaten during that day. And in fact, maybe providentially, Charles de Foucauld had not had breakfast. He said no. And immediately after the confession, Father Ouvelin said, "Then go and receive communion." The moment I realized that God existed, he later wrote, "I knew I could not do otherwise than to live for him alone." So his conversion to the faith, or reversion to the faith, and his religious vocation were intimately tied. I don't want to get into too much detail about his exploration of different congregations. He was attracted to the life of the parish priest, but he found it too worldly, too easy for the sort of devotion that he was called to, and eventually he entered the Trappists. And the hardest part about entering the Trappist monastery for him was because the Trappist is called to live a cloistered life, and he has had to say goodbye to his cousin Marie de Bondy. That's her married name, and you have the quotation there in which he expresses his grief at saying goodbye to her. It's a complicated relationship. When he was younger, Charles, even before his conversion, he felt very close to Marie. And throughout his life, and we'll see even on the day of his death, he continued to be filled with a sense of unity with Marie and a sense of reverence for her wisdom and her faith. And so he in fact, was determined at this point to say goodbye to her and never to see her again. And although he was generally a man of his word, he couldn't stick to this one. And we'll see she comes back into his life at a later period. He was known while a monk at Notre Dame des Neiges in the southern part of France, which is up in the mountains, the highest Trappist monastery in France, for his piety. People were already calling him a saint, mostly because of his obedience. He wasn't ordained a priest. He was living as a brother or a simple monk. And so you have that quotation there. He felt that the life, however, at Notre Dame des Neiges was still too easy, and he requested to be transferred to a Trappist monastery that had recently been established under the authority of Notre Dame des Neiges in a site which is today in Turkey, but at the time was considered part of the Ottoman province of Syria at Akbes. And he established himself there in 1890. Again, he impressed monks with his passion for asceticism and also obedience. There were some prophetic statements that were made about God making him into a saint, and yet he was still unsatisfied with the lifestyle. He felt especially deluded when some changes to the order and the rigor of the Trappist life were instituted. For example, allowing the use of olive oil at meals and not being able to eat only with salt as seasoning. And so something else that disturbed him, however, was that the liturgy of the hours that the monks would pray in the Mass were all done in Latin, and he was living in the Middle East, surrounded by Arabs and Armenians and Turks and Kurds, and he had this passion to proclaim the gospel. And how could an Arab or an Armenian or a Turk or Kurd come into the monastery and listen to Latin and understand the gospel? How could they be touched by the gospel? And so he had this vision of establishing an order that would pray in the vernacular and that would be close to the people. There was an interesting, dramatic moment in the monastery at Akbes when, after the beginning of the genocide against, people remember the Armenian genocide, but you've probably heard of the Armenian genocide. There are different stages of that, first in 1870, again in 1895 to 1896, and then again during the First World War. Actually, there were massacres against all of the Christians in what is now Turkey, including those who spoke Syriac, the Syriac-speaking Christians, but also the Armenians. And indeed, the monastery was threatened, and Charles de Foucauld, the officer, returned. He established the defense of the monastery, and from some locals, they had some weapons, and there was a battle which took place in which basically they defended the monastery from militias who had come to kill them. During this time, he wrote a rule for the Little Brothers of Jesus, which he already had a vision of this new order that he would found. I already mentioned the aspect of the vernacular language. Those are some of the elements of the ascetic lifestyle that he imagined them to live. The only problem was the Trappists weren't ready to let him go. In fact, they felt that he had a vocation to become maybe a superior or a rector, or maybe even more within the order. And they sent him to Rome, which, Rome's a great city, but that's not where he wanted to go. And so he begged, upon arriving in Rome and being assigned to theological studies at the Gregorian University, he begged his superior, the Trappist superior in Rome, to be released from the order altogether. And it was one of the sort of pivotal moments of his life when he was given permission to leave the Trappist order. And there we have that reflection by his superior. He's an exceptional individual. He's as stubborn as a mule, but he is humble of heart. His first move after being released from the Trappist order was to Nazareth. And this is connected to his passion, as I've mentioned, for the hidden years of Christ at Nazareth. And he went there as a pilgrim. He arrived in Jaffa, and he went by foot all the way from Jaffa up into the hills of Galilee to the city of Nazareth. He wanted to live where Christ lived, and he established himself at a monastery of a convent of the Poor Clare, the cloistered sisters. And they offered him a house. And he said, no, there's a hut just outside of the convent, and he lived there as a gardener. And this is where he felt he had finally begun to live out the particular calling of Christ to be the last and the least, as he put it. The story is told that he was living on bread, and as I mentioned, I think the Poor Clares would every once in a while deliver dates or figs or almonds to him because they were worried about his health. And he would go into the town of Nazareth and distribute the dates and figs and almonds without the nuns knowing that he was doing so. There's a statement which expresses his vision to be the last and the least, to order my life so as to be the last, the most despised of men. And there we see how he was feeling that it wasn't right for him to be taking 2 meals. There is so little mortification in my life. I suffer so little that since yesterday I've begun to take only 1 meal. I think as I was reading this, I had like a coffee and a muffin in front of me. And I was thinking, I've got a long way to go to aspire to the life of Charles de Foucauld. There are a couple of events that were pivotal in his lifetime or his experience in Palestine. One was a mystical experience where he said, "Who entered me, who united with me in a union that has no earthly name?" It was the one, he had many experiences of spiritual joy, but this was an experience of mystical union with Christ. But the key moment in terms of the trajectory of his life is when the Poor Clares in Nazareth said, you should meet the superior of our order in Jerusalem, or of that province of the Poor Clares. And when he did so, and he expressed his vision for this order of the Little Brothers of Jesus, she said, well, you've got to be a priest. You can't remain a simple brother or a hermit. You have to be a priest. And this is something that the Trappists, of course, had wished. That's why they sent him to the Gregorian University. Before the Trappists, this is something that Father Ouvelin, his confessor in Paris, had wished for him. They couldn't get their way. After all, he was as stubborn as a mule. But this simple cloistered nun, who he could only look at through the grating that he was allowed to speak with her through, had this power and convinced him to do so. One of the more peculiar chapters of his life took place when he decided that he was going to establish this community. He was going to seek ordination from the Patriarch of Jerusalem and establish this community on a hill outside of or what's known as the Mount of Beatitudes, the traditional spot of where Christ proclaimed the Beatitudes, just outside of the Sea of Galilee. And he spent 13,000 francs of his sister's money, and it was all a ruse in which the person who took the money never actually owned the land, and he disappeared. He also had a dream of martyrdom. If he was going to be the last and the least, the most despised of all men, where else could this lead him? He knew of a man who had been killed by Muslims in Libya during a geographical exploration by the name of Marquis de Moore. And he wrote, "Within the great charity that abounds in heaven, there is nothing but prayer and love for those Muslims who have spilled his blood, and he will perhaps spill mine." We're going to return to this because this vision of martyrdom and love for the one who would take his life is connected directly, I think, to the experience of the monks of Tiberine, who will be killed in 1996. And I believe there was an earlier Saturday with the Saints talk on the monks of Tiberine. It was also during his time in Nazareth that Charles de Foucauld scribbled in a notebook, Jesus love, Jesus caritas, and the symbol of both the cross for Jesus in the heart, that's why this talk is called The Heart for Muslims, and the heart, which would become the symbol of the order of the little brothers and little sisters of Jesus. Okay, we need to do this in about 7 minutes. So the good news for you is that the talk's almost done. Bad news for me is I don't have that much time to speak about the whole episode of Charles de Foucauld in North Africa. First is to say that his determination to be ordained a priest bore fruit, not by the Patriarch of Jerusalem, who refused to ordain him, since he was not from any province connected to Palestine, but he was ordained back in France. And he received permission to found a community of little brothers, and he was determined to do so in a place where he could be with the poor, in a place where the gospel had not been heard. And so he established himself in western Algeria, in Beni Abbas, which was a small town, which also had a French garrison. near the Moroccan border. He had this vision of returning to Morocco where there were no Christians, and he would be surrounded only by Muslims and some Jews and could proclaim the gospel there. At Beni Abbas, he discovered that slavery in Algeria, especially in southern Algeria, where you had a population of black Africans who were regularly enslaved, some of them emancipated, but many who were enslaved, together with Tuaregs, Berbers, and Arabs. And part of his mission at this time was to raise money from his contacts from the nobility in France to redeem slaves. So that's something that today we look at the life of Charles de Foucauld and we're like, that's great, that's inspiring. But there's this other element of the life of Charles de Foucauld, which is he believed in the project of the French nation in North Africa. And that's something we look at today with maybe some more skepticism. Colonialism is bad, imperialism is bad. But he believed that France could bring peace to North Africa. And he also believed, and this is not something that's very popular to think about today, but he also believed that that peace and the presence of the French in North Africa could lead to the proclamation of the gospel. And that is a good. Even when he came to believe that Muslims could be saved without baptism, he still believed in the power of the gospel and in the work of evangelization. It's just this nice comment that he writes. July 2nd, 1904, while in North Africa, he writes, "Today is the feast of the Visitation, the patronal feast of all the communities of the little brothers and little sisters of the heart of Jesus." Yeah, which is very inspiring. Of course, remember, he was the only little brother in the world. This is where Beni Abbas, Western Algeria, this is after rains or the melting of snow really from Morocco, it fills with a seasonal river. He wasn't satisfied ultimately in staying in Beni Abbas because much of his work was taken up by the spiritual needs of the French garrison. And one of the tensions he always felt was the problem of seeking isolation, contemplation, solitude, and the need also to minister, to evangelize, to serve the poor. How do these go together? How do silence and dialogue go together? Well, he eventually had the opportunity to go into an even more remote region in southern Algeria, Tamanrasset, where there was no French garrison and no presence of Christians. In fact, there was no priest for 400 miles around, and really no Christians. And he settled among a people known as a Tuareg, who are not Arabs. They are Muslims. They're also not Berbers. They have their own distinct language. And as we'll see, one of his projects was to create a dictionary, a French Tuareg dictionary, which was 2,000 pages. He also translated the Gospels into Tuareg, or to the language of the Tuareg. He didn't do so just to dialogue with them or just to be a presence. He had an ardent wish for their conversion. And he conceived a special love for their culture. This is the typical dress of the Tuareg. The men wear headscarves and veils. Not only the women, but the men do as well. But he also began to feel a despair in Tamanrasset. No conversions, and he didn't have for many years the authorization to celebrate Mass alone. Mass was understood, as you may know, to be a communal experience, and for many years there was no permission to celebrate Mass alone. He wrote, "A tree is known by its fruit, and mine shows what I am, a useless servant." I was speaking with my colleague before the talk, and in fact, there were two people he baptized. All of these years of ministry in North Africa, he baptized two. There was one Muslim, but an old widow, a woman who lived by herself, who was baptized. And then one of the black Africans whom he ransomed as a child, he baptized. So it wasn't a convert, but he baptized as a child, took the name of Abd Yesu, the servant of Jesus. But after his death, his example has led to great spiritual fruit. But in his life, he felt that he was a useless servant. He also had yearning for a companion, in part because he wanted to be able to celebrate Mass, but also because he wanted to found this order, and he couldn't do it all alone. And for 1 year, he had a companion, someone who took the religious name Brother Michel. He stayed only for 1 year, but he left us a witness to the daily life of Blessed Charles, which I'll just let you read there. He always walks bare feet and chapped from the cold in crude sandals. He wears a robe of unbleached cotton, etc., etc. He accounts also the adoration or the respect and veneration of the Tuareg people for Blessed Charles because of his example. He had 3 trips back to France during this time in the hopes of founding an order, and this is where Marie de Blondy returns in his life. You see a picture of her there, along with Charles de Foucauld. There he met Louis Massignon, who I spoke about at the beginning of the talk. He invited Massignon to join him. Massignon wavered for years between joining him or pursuing an academic career. I just have this anecdote because he eventually decided to apply for a position in history at the University of Lyon. And the committee there said, you won't have this job unless you declare in your word of honor that you will never attend High Mass. He responded, I am a free man. Massignon would never join de Foucauld. Here we have the image there is from his time in France in 1913, where he brought one of his Tuareg friends, a young man named Uksem, along with him. But he did win approval to establish this congregation of the Little Brothers of Jesus. Okay, we're almost at the end here. Towards the end of his life, he built a hermitage in the mountains of southern Algeria, not far from Tamanrasset, in a place called Assekrem. That's the vision or the view from his hermitage. I've already mentioned about his vision of French colonization. He also made plans for his death. He was in very bad health, and he had one crisis of health in 1908 where he was on the verge of death. But death would come finally in 1916. Now, a whole talk could be given about the causes for the death of Charles de Foucauld, but very briefly, of course, the Great War had begun in 1914, and just like Europe, North Africa was divided and the scene of confrontations between German and French and other forces. In North Africa, the Germans were aligned with the Turks, who were established in Libya, and they were leading expeditions and using different militias to lead expeditions into French Algeria. And one group actually connected to a Muslim brotherhood, we could speak more about this during the question and answer time, known as the Senussis. We're part of a Sufi group, but we're also, some people, if you've ever heard of Sufis, your image is probably whirling dervishes, very peaceful and loving. Some Sufis were also militarized groups, like the Senussi. And Blessed Charles knew that they were coming closer and closer to Tamanrasset, in that the life of his people and his own life was endangered. For this reason, he moved into a fort near his hermitage. You have the little image there. Basically, I've said all of this. Our account of Blessed Charles' death comes from his sacristan, who was never baptized, but was there when Blessed Charles was killed by Paul. His name was Paul Mberic. It was a black African who, at the time, he was never baptized, but was also not a Muslim. But when the time came when he was put at gunpoint by these Senussi militants, he claimed to be a Muslim and his life was spared. And he recounts above all that Blessed Charles was silent as he was held at gunpoint by these militants. The story comes that people had come to actually help Blessed Charles. 2 Algerians had come to interrupt the raid on the fort. Blessed Charles was already tied with his ankles attached to his wrists, behind his back, on his knees. And the plan was to kidnap him, not to kill him. And when the these 2 Algerian Arabs came to interrupt and to save Blessed Charles, the militants panicked. And one of them, who was a young man at the time, at the age of 15 or 16, shot Blessed Charles through the head. The details of his death are interesting because one of the pressing questions also about his canonization is whether he died as a martyr. And we could speak more about that during the question and answer. On the day of his death, he was killed at nighttime about 7 p.m. He wrote 3 letters, and I just, by way of conclusion, like to share a little bit from 2 of the letters. One is to Louis Massignon, who we remember resisted the call to join Blessed Charles in the desert. But he did serve France in World War I. And Charles and Louis, they weren't pacifists who believed that all nations are wonderful, and we were both French patriots who believed in the cause of the First World War. Blessed Charles wrote to him that you should never be afraid of danger. Let us leave honor to whoever wishes it, but danger, difficulty, let us always claim them. May God keep you and protect France. May Jesus, Mary, and Joseph keep you with during your whole earthly life, at the hour of your death, and through eternity. And as is fitting, I think, for the arc of Blessed Charles' life, he also wrote to Marie de Blondie. This is the day of his death, December 1, 1916. How true it is that we shall never love enough. But God, who knows what clay he shaped us from, and loves us more than a mother can her child, God, who does not lie, has told us that he will not repulse anyone who comes to him. Just as a final note, I'd like to just note that his story is connected to that of the martyrs of Tiberine, who in 1996, as you may know, many of them were abducted. You may know them from the movie Of Gods and Men. It was exactly 80 years after the death of Blessed Charles that they were abducted on the night between March 26 and March 27, and their decapitated bodies were later found. You may also know that these monks, along with the other martyrs of the Algerian Civil War, will be beatified by Pope Francis this December 8th. The beatification will take place not in Vatican City, but in Algeria, the land that Blessed Charles and the Trappist monks loved. Blessed Charles was himself beatified only in 2005. The process began in the 1920s. It was finally moved forward by John Paul II, but John Paul II died earlier that year, as you may know, so it was Benedict XVI who beatified Blessed Charles. His feast day is coming up, so you can remember that maybe back home on December 1st. And in fact, with the help of Massignon, who of course had never joined him in the flesh, he joined him spiritually by establishing, together with with colleagues, the Congregation of the Little Brothers in 1933. And then Massignon, although he chose the life of academia and marriage, he became a Melkite Catholic and was ordained a priest in 1950. Thank you very much.